Hello and welcome back to another episode of Majlis and Markets. I am your host Hassan Jivraj. Majlis and Markets brings you thought-provoking conversations with influential leaders in Islamic and global markets. Wherever you're listening to us, remember to like, share and subscribe. Get in touch with us also by sending us an email at hassan@majlisandmarkets.com. In today's episode, we're looking at Egypt's economy. Egypt's economy is under intense pressure, with a currency crisis, soaring debt, rampant inflation, and a struggling private sector. But there's hope with a major UAE investment in February 2024 and a recent IMF bailout. Plus, Egypt's entry into BRICS in 2023 hints a shift eastward. To help us understand Egypt's future, we're joined by Beth Morrissey, managing partner and co-founder of Climate International Consultants. As a specialist in emerging markets, Beth offers valuable insights into global economic trends. In our discussion, we cover Egypt's currency crisis, debt, FDI, private sector struggles, and broader political economy issues. Beth Morrissey, welcome to Majlis and Markets. Great to have you here.
Thank you, Hassan.
Beth, you've got quite an interesting background. I came across you last year when I was working at a publication on foreign direct investment. Obviously, I've followed your work before that, covering emerging market bonds, and I'm really interested in learning more about what you're doing at your current venture. And obviously, we're talking about Egypt today. But before we get into all of that, could you give us or give our listeners your early life and how you got into emerging markets?
Sure. I was actually a foreign exchange student between high school and university. And I told the program that I wanted to go someplace, quote unquote, different. I didn't want to go to Western Europe. I'd, already been there. And I wanted to go someplace that had a very different culture. So they sent me to live with a Turkish family for a year. So then after that year was over, I went to college and I did a self-designed major in Middle Eastern studies. And then, like you, I got my master's in Middle Eastern studies. So the Middle East has actually always been my sort of pet project, although we certainly covered the world and we're probably best known for doing research and advisory services on some of the more frontier markets at the moment.
And this is with Climate.
Yeah, we started actually, our best bullet point is Climate International actually predates the MSCI Emerging Markets Index and Brady Bonds.
Wow.
We started my first year out of graduate school. I was really young. And we decided that, emerging markets the IFC had recently coined the term, Antoine von Akmel had recently coined the term emerging markets, which replaced some of the other terms that were being used, like least developed countries and whatever. And we decided that people were really beginning to take a look. And my business partner, Gary Kleiman, had lived in various markets, Vietnam, Thailand, Tunisia. So we decided that since the world was starting to really take a look at emerging markets, that we'd come along for the ride. And some of our clients we've known for 35 years.
Fantastic. And, I probably first heard about the term emerging markets back in 2009 or 10 when Dubai was going through a bit of a debt restructuring. And then obviously you had people like Mark Mobius, who's obviously very famous in the emerging market investing world. For our listeners, Beth, what exactly is an emerging market?
Well, the traditional definition is the World Bank per capita GDP. There's a cutoff, and I don't recall what it is in 2024. But I think the best way to describe an emerging market now is it's not Western Europe, it's not the US, it's not Japan, it's not Australia and New Zealand. and pretty much everybody else falls into either emerging or frontier category.
And is there like a certain criteria to be an emerging or frontier market, would you say?
Well, it's most of the definition in terms of emerging and frontier is based on the availability of capital markets and how open they are and how freely traded they are and what their size is. And that tends to be sort of I think people look at the MSCI index and say, okay, these are the core emerging markets, these are the frontier markets, and then we've got this bevy of other markets all over, particularly sub-Saharan Africa and Central Asia that haven't quite climbed into the frontier category yet.
And what's interesting, Beth, is like I remember when the GCC countries were included in the JP Morgan, and then this is obviously like JP Morgan, Morgan Stanley with the MSCI. So these are big American institutions, which kind of like, is it kind of like a benchmark for American, well, I would say international investors to, they meet like a certain criteria before they put their money into the market or put their money into that specific asset
Yeah,
class.
it depends, of course, on the type of institution that's investing. But for instance, pension funds and insurance companies very much track these standard indices, and they're a great measure. I mean, I think South Korea is probably a great example. They've been trying for years to be upgraded to developed market status on the MSCI index, and MSCI keeps saying, no, you don't meet all the criteria. Once you meet all the criteria that our committee has decided that every market must meet, then you can be upgraded. And being upgraded generally takes some time. There are some countries that have been, downgraded from emerging to frontier because they've imposed, capital controls, or there's not adequate currency to get your money out of the country.
And from a country's perspective, why is it advantageous to be listed in these indices?
Well, for instance, I think the Indian bonds right now are probably the best example. JP Morgan announced that within a year, 30 some odd Indian government securities were going to be included in their index. And last September, they announced this. And since then, there's been massive inflows. They just started adding them at the end of last month. But the money is just pouring into India. The first week, which would have been the first week in July, which would have been, I guess, last week, India's foreign reserves hit an all new time high because all this money flowed in tracking the index.
And would you say a lot of this money is like passively managed money? Because like it seems to me like a lot of the institutional money is passively managed compared to say more active funds.
Yes, it's passively managed. It's against the index. So if you add, 10 Indian government bonds, then people are going to invest, all of a sudden all this money is going to flow into these 10 Indian government bonds.
No, definitely India's been a star player in like the financial markets, I'd say, in the past like year or so.
Yes,
But
India can do no wrong at the moment, it seems.
well, yeah. But Beth, we're talking today about Egypt, and Egypt's a very interesting country. We had Angus Blair on a few episodes back, and he gave us a nice oversight of his experience in Egypt. But I'd like to talk to you about Egypt probably over the last, say, decade. We can talk a little bit more about the lead up to the last decade with the 2011 uprising or revolution, however you characterize it. What are your high-level thoughts to begin with? What are your high-level thoughts on Egypt today?
Well, can I start going back even further than a decade?
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah.
This is sort of my standard Egypt argument at the moment. Back in the early 1990s, when Egypt was under an IMF program, they were told to privatize. They were told to float the currency. I was there for about a month on a World Bank USAID project that was supposed to help develop the capital markets and move the privatization program along. It appears that every time the IMF goes back to Egypt, which has been more than a few times, they've dusted off the same program.
Hmm.
And what was fascinating to me earlier this year was there was a privatization of paints and chemicals. And guess what? That company was on the list in the early 1990s. So the progress that's been made in these IMF programs has been negligible at best for decades.
Yeah, it seems like the IMF, is I think Egypt's probably, other than Argentina and maybe Pakistan, Egypt's probably up there with like being the most recipient of IMF funding. Uh,
Egypt's the second largest after Argentina.
okay, so yeah, there you go. Yeah, so it doesn't really surprise me. And like, it's interesting. Like, if you look at Egypt, say when they had their revolution, I think in 1952, and then you had that period of Jamal Abdel Nasser ruling, and then you had Anwar Sadat, and then obviously with the assassination of Anwar Sadat, and then Hosni Mubarak came in. They went through different phases of economic model, let's say, or philosophy. You were there obviously in the 1990s when they pivoted more towards, say, the IMF. I'm not saying they didn't do that under Anwar Sadat, but it seems like, yeah, they've been in this like cycle since, say, since the 1980s, 1990s, where they're constantly going back to the IMF for money.
Well, it's interesting because when they went to the IMF in the early 90s, that was the period of time where the IMF and USAID and all of the donors um, were focused specifically on privatization of state-owned companies because they were doing it all over Central Europe after the wall came down. I mean, that was the prescription. You build your capital markets and you privatize your state-owned companies. And that was the prescription all over the world.
Yeah, it seems like when we spoke to like I said, when we spoke to Angus, one of the things he mentioned, he was in Egypt, I think, in 2003, so about nearly more than 20 years ago, and he said there was a lot of euphoria and optimism about Egypt, and leading on to what you said from the 90s. But it seems like since '07, '08, and then obviously leading up to 2011 to today, there hasn't been that much optimism for Egypt, let's say, other than say its bonds. But like maybe we can start on the debt for Egypt. There's Egypt's in quite a lot of fiscal trouble, amongst which is their external debt, the debt to GDP. I think I was reading the other day that a large part of their debt to GDP was on the interest payment. Um,
Yes.
and in 2017, Beth, I used to write about these bonds for a Financial Wire, and I remember every like couple of months, Egypt would come to the bond market, the Euro bond market, and this was when they received the debt at the time in 2016 when they received the IMF bailout, and the IMF was saying, you got to do this, you got to do that, and at the same time, you felt like, okay, I've heard this song before, I've heard this story before, and then when I used to speak to the debt capital markets bankers on Egyptian bond deals, they were like very happy on it, and the portfolio managers on the other side of the trade were really happy, to buy Egyptian bonds because it was giving a good yield in a low interest environment. But it seems like now it's gone all pretty horribly wrong. Where would you say Egypt's debt situation is today?
Well, I mean, obviously the events in Israel and Gaza have put Egypt on a different level than other IMF borrowers. I mean, Egypt is arguably, too big to fail, too big to bail. And geopolitically, Egypt is too important to ignore for official money. Now, that being said, all this attention has attracted, all of this new money. The Emirati deal that was announced, and interesting, just after the IMF program started at the end of 22, beginning of 23, the GCC countries who had been just simply depositing money in the Central Bank of Egypt finally said, no, we want our money to work. We're not going to just keep handing it over. And I think that sort of spurred the Egyptians to really start to look at this again.
So Beth, you were talking a little bit about the fixed income performance, and you were talking about some of the maturities and some of the debts that they had to pay back. What kind of debts did Egypt have to pay back?
Well, they paid back a 2 billion euro bond last quarter. They paid back an enormous amount of domestic debt. In fact, their external debt came down 4.4%, which is the lowest since June of 2022. However, that being said, they're in their budget for the current fiscal year that just started, debt servicing is 47.4% of spending.
Wow.
I mean, that's not sustainable. That is not sustainable over the long term. They've got, they've cut subsidies. They're trying to reach a massive primary budget surplus. And now they've said that they plan to use 50% of the IPO proceeds from privatization to simply pay off debt, to lower their debt level.
And Beth, you think it seems to me, like I said before, 2016 to 2022, that 6-year period, they just went bananas, they really did the binge with the debt. You got the projects like the new capital, which they were building, or are building rather. But it seems to me that since there's a couple of factors here. You got COVID-19, which happened in 2019. You had the Russia-Ukraine conflict in 2022. And at the same time, with all of this happening, you also had higher interest rates in the US. So the borrowing market became a lot more expensive for Egypt to service. Do you think that kind of had an impact on where they are today?
Well, I think one of the biggest impacts was the minute that Russia invaded Ukraine, $20 billion flowed out of their local bond market from foreign investors. I mean, that's just an enormous amount of money. And it was gone in a matter of, 2 weeks.
Mm.
So that on top of, what they spent on COVID and has brought them to where they are today.
And then, Beth, another thing that I find interesting about Egypt's debt to GDP ratio, or the debt situation, is that, they became a member of the BRICS Plus in 2023. They've issued Sukuk before, so they've tapped Islamic investors in the world, mostly in the Middle East and Southeast Asia. They've issued Panta bond, so they're tapping Chinese investors. It seems like they're going at every single route possible just to get, the servicing and the financing of their budget.
Yes, the official line is they're diversifying their borrowing. But no, I mean, if you're issuing panda bonds, I mean, nobody had issued a panda bond in years. And part of that was, BRICS. They're also looking to borrow from the new development bank, the so-called BRICS Bank. And they expect to have a loan in place by the end of the year.
And do they get more, better pricing, would you say, on these kind of newer currencies or newer alternative markets rather than traditional Eurobond markets?
Yeah, because I mean, they were the first, I mean, for the panda bonds. I mean, nobody had issued a panda bond in years. So it was the glamour factor.
So, and forgive me if I remember, but when I used to write about these fixed income notes, that panda bonds were good for some issuers because they could tap a Chinese market, a Chinese pension market, which was fairly opaque but very deep and very willing to buy these kind of debt. And obviously, I think in China probably they wouldn't have been able to get a higher yield coupon, let's say, than on a traditional Chinese security.
Well, and of course, the becoming a member of the BRICS means that the state-owned banks, which dominate China's bond market, the state-owned banks were probably encouraged, would be a nice way to put it, to buy this paper.
Yeah, it seems like it's a very strategic play from both sides. Beth, one thing I wanted to ask you is that in tandem with the bond situation or the debt to GDP situation, we'll come back to what's happening today, and I think you've touched on this a bit. But the other part of the puzzle here, or one of the pieces of the puzzle here, is that the currency, Egypt's currency, has been in a flux, let's say, over the past couple of months and years, and probably decades as well. where did this all start with the currency problems that they've been having?
They've been having these problems for decades. Um, okay, so the IMF came in and they let the pound fall about 40% in March because they were having chronic FX shortages. I mean, they weren't able to pay for imports. There were shortages. The currency's down about 55% against the dollar the past year. But what's interesting is, and we've seen this in other instances where Egypt's been under an IMF program, the IMF says, you got to float the currency. The Central Bank of Egypt says, okay, we'll allow it to be market determined. Okay, so it plummeted in March to what the market thought was a fair rate. However, since then, I pulled up a couple charts yesterday to prepare for this. And interesting, since then, the currency's barely budged. It's been between 47 point something and 48 point something. I mean, it does not appear to be, it appears to be about as market determined as the RMB.
Yeah, I'm just thinking back again to 2016 when they took that IMF program, and one of the things I had a friend in Egypt who was working at one of the banks over there, and he basically said, overnight the Egyptian pound to dollar was, I think it was artificial rate was 8, but then as soon as they took the IMF money and did the devaluation, it went to like from 8 to 16 overnight.
Yeah.
So people's like regular people's savings just basically got eroded, um, in a very short space of time. So I guess that has an impact on the domestic population, right? And not just on the imports and exports for the government.
Oh, definitely. And at the same time, in order to meet the IMF program, they're removing subsidies, which, were very, very costly. But what's interesting is they recently raised the price of bread for the first time since, are you ready for this? 1988.
Wow,
1988.
the year I was
Uh,
born. Yeah, so
they, the last time, and I can't recall exactly which year it was, but the last time they tried to raise the price of bread, there was, massive civil unrest. This time,
2008, right? But in 2008, I think they tried to do that.
yeah, and this time there wasn't.
Mm.
And I think part of that is the whole maybe political environment.
And you should also mention that Egypt's the largest wheat importer in the world. So it's very reliant on wheat imports from say like Russia and Ukraine.
Yeah,
Uh,
and that's of course what's really hurt, on top of not having the cash to pay for the imports in recent months. Well, in recent years, I guess one would say at this point. Um, their major supplier were Russia and Ukraine. So the wheat's just not coming.
And with regards to like access to foreign cash, we talked about a little bit about IMF, but also, Egypt's very reliant on tourism, which brings in foreign money, whether it be euros or dollars and euros rather, or any other currency for that matter. How much of an impact has COVID? I know COVID's been gone for now. It's happened about 4 years ago now, but how much of an impact has the tourism sector recovered? Would you say?
The tourism sector has in fact recovered. Um, in fact, tourism revenues were actually up last year, despite what's going on next door. But I mean, tourism is of course one of their largest sources of foreign exchange, but it's what's happening in the Red Sea with the Suez Canal that is that's really, really pressuring them.
Or what is happening in the Suez Canal? Maybe you could tell our listeners.
Well, the fact that the Houthis are bombing and Suez Canal traffic is down quite significantly. And of course, that's a major, major, major source of revenue.
So that's having an impact on the government's coffers if there's less trade going through or fewer boats going through.
Oh yeah, 7.5% drop in Suez Canal receipts.
Mm.
And what's also interesting is remittances were down 17% in the first 3 quarters of the last fiscal year. But at the same time, tourism revenues were up over 5%.
But that still doesn't cover the shortfall of the
No,
drop.
it certainly doesn't.
And what about the rest of the economy, would you say? Like, I know they've got a big textile industry. Are those performing any better, or?
They have attracted, I mean, FDI is really picking up. And part of that is they've reached out to new trade partners. I mean, just in the past couple weeks, a major Turkish textile manufacturer announced that they were investing in Egypt because it's cheaper to produce in Egypt than it is in Turkey, which has 70% plus inflation.
Mm.
And UNCTAD just announced this week that that Egypt was the lead destination on the entire African continent for FDI in 2013 and accounted for nearly 20% of Africa's total foreign direct investment. I mean,
Wow.
that's a pretty amazing number.
And
Including,
where was this FDI going? Was it going into like specific sectors or specific?
it was going into, there were some major investments in green projects, totaling something like $14-15 billion.
Mm.
And the other sectors that were really interesting, that seemed really interesting, were automotives,
Mm.
again, cheaper production, pharma, which a lot of big emerging markets are attracting a lot of interest from international pharma companies in the wake of COVID because it's cheaper to manufacture in an emerging market. And interestingly, electronics. And part of this pickup in FDI is last year they actually introduced I don't think there's a better term, a one-stop shop for investment projects, which is supposed to speed up the process enormously. You don't have to walk from ministry to ministry to get it stamped. It all happens in one place. But that being said, FDI did drop 13% last year, but it also dropped all over the world because of high global interest rates.
Mm. And then, because they've been trying really hard, I think, over the last couple of years to get a lot of investment into their energy sector. You know, they made some gas finds and some oil finds off the Suez coast, and they seem to, you know, really want to attract, like you said, for hydrogen and for green energy. So
yeah, there's an enormous amount of interest because of where they are strategically, geopolitically, and the resources that are there.
And then conversely,
because once you're there, you can go to the Middle East, you can go to Africa.
Yeah, no, absolutely. One thing you mentioned, Beth, is like, you know, a lot of these companies, like pharma companies and automotives, are relocating to Egypt, or relocating parts of their production to Egypt because of the lower cost. But also, wouldn't you say that there's also an opportunity here is that Egypt's a country of, I think, about 110 million people. So it's a large consumer market as well, right? To consume.
Well, it's not only a large consumer market, but there's, you know, in contrast to, you know, whereas a Western European company might have gone to, you know, Poland in the past, Egypt actually has all these skilled workers that are unemployed because there's not enough employment for all these university graduates. And Egypt has a very well-educated population.
And then one thing you mentioned earlier, Beth, was that the UAE's obviously poured a lot of money into Egypt this year, and you know it's not the first time, and it probably won't be the last time. You know, this was a massive deal that they did in February 2024. Arguably, it saved Egypt from complete ruin and default financially. How important was this UAE bailout, I would say, or aid rather?
Investment. We'll call it an investment.
Good word, yeah.
Well, actually, what that did was, on top of having the IMF program and, actually getting the first couple tranches of funding, which meant that they met, you know, some of their targets. Just this year, they've secured between the IMF, the ongoing IMF program, but in investments and aid from the UAE, IMF, World Bank, EU, et cetera, they've secured 57 billion in investments and aid.
Wow, 57 billion. That's a
Well,
lot.
that's spread out from now till 2027,
It's
but
still a
still,
lot.
that's still a lot of money. And a
And
lot of it is investment.
mm,
The EU had a trade and investment summit or something very recently, and there were something like 40 new deals signed.
so obviously a lot of these pledges are going towards projects and investments in Egypt. So it's not exactly like the old days where they used to get a lot of money in central bank deposits from, say, like the Gulf countries, and they just leave it in the central bank. These are actual like real greenfield projects that they have to invest in.
Yes, these are honest to God real projects. Um, which is, I mean, as I said earlier, the GCC had made clear a year ago that, they were not just going to continue to dump money into the central bank. They want a return on their investment. And, the same thing the EU's obviously given, plenty of
Mm.
budgetary support and such. But at the same time, at this summit, there were all these commitments made by EU companies that were going to invest in projects in Egypt.
And the one thing I wanted to just stick on the economy, Beth, was one of the things I think that's interesting about Egypt is that given its economic size and population size, the banking sector is still relatively controlled. And that's going to come on to the next thing I wanted to talk to you about, which is the political. I think one of Egypt's biggest problems is its political economy, which kind of goes to the heart of the issue, in my opinion, is that a lot of this is to do with how much control the military has or military-owned companies have on the economy. I mean, how big of an impact is that?
Well, it's interesting. The three biggest banks are still state owned. They're still state owned. And according to Fitch, at the end of last year, the banking sector's total exposure to sovereign debt and broader sort of, public sector company debt was about 50% of total assets. So, no, we're not talking a real sophisticated banking sector here yet. But what's interesting is outside of the actual formal banking sector, the non-bank financial institutions are quite sophisticated.
Yeah, no,
The capital market's been making huge changes. And just last month they launched a new Islamic index with 33 companies and who were already in their main EGX 100 index. And all of the names are really well known. They're some of the biggest companies on the EGX index. And they've not only got a stock exchange committee that oversaw how they were forming this index, but obviously they had the Islamic scholars as well. And that's drawn a lot of interest. They're going to be trading carbon credits, really. The big state-owned banks are sort of still state-owned behemoths. The rest of the financial sector is actually developing quite nicely.
Yeah, no, there's also a lot of venture capital activity as well in Egypt.
Yeah.
The fintechs and other tech companies. So there's quite a vibrant VC ecosystem in Egypt, which is quite refreshing to see. And like you said, I think the capital markets and the development outside of the formal banking institutions, there's a lot of activity going on there, which is quite encouraging to see. But again, Beth, the thing I wanted to ask you is, How hard is it for Egypt to change its economic structure?
Well, the political will has to be there to allow the private sector into the economy. And the current government, has publicly committed to this. They've committed to it in the IMF program. And, how quickly can it happen? Number one. And number two is, the bigger question is the political will really there? I mean, these big state-owned banks, Bank Dakar, Bank Musser, they've been on the privatization list for 30 years. And yeah, some of their shares are traded, but they're still state-owned.
And that's not just specific to finance, right? In other sectors as well, the
Oh,
military
right.
companies are there.
Oh, yeah. And the military, what's interesting is the military actually, I mean, not only do they control so many of these companies, but back in 2016 under the IMF program where, they instituted a new VAT, the military and other security organizations are exempt from this VAT. They don't have to pay VAT on goods, on equipment, on machinery, on services, on raw materials. In fact, VAT, the military owns hotels. That is not even charged at the military hotel in Cairo. I mean, that's just absurd. They're just giving up all this potential money. But on the other hand, that's how the political economy runs there and always has.
And to change that, do you think it's quite difficult?
Yeah, I think politically it's probably not feasible because if you tell the military you're going to make them sell off their companies, there is the threat of a military uprising.
Yeah, because it doesn't sound too dissimilar from other countries in the world where the military has a big stake in the economy or influence in the economy rather, or presence. But it seems to me this is one of the biggest problems for Egypt's like to make Egypt a more liberal economy is to not have the military there.
Right. And I mean, they dominate some sectors.
Yeah, so that makes it difficult for like real private companies to compete against them both
Oh,
in
they
terms.
can't. They
Well, yeah,
can't because a private company has to pay tax.
yeah. So it's an unfair like
So the
advantage.
military is always going to undercut them.
Mm. And yeah, there doesn't seem to be any like appetite to change that anytime soon.
No, no, I think it's probably too much of a political risk for the government.
When from your experience, you've been in Egypt for a while. When did this like become a really big issue? Do you think it's been there since say 1950s, or has it been
Oh, I
more?
think it's been there since, yes, it's been there since the 50s.
And to change
And
that,
it's grown exponentially.
mm. So it's been there since say when Nasser came in 52, and
Yeah, and the military was sort of handed these companies and they've still got them.
mm. So it's difficult to change that. Um, and then two other areas I wanted to ask you, Beth, was well, they're kind of interconnected. One is climate risks. I think every country in the region is facing climate risk. Um, what kind of risks is Egypt facing with regards to climate?
The same as the entire continent. And the biggest risk is lack of water, is drought. And that, as we all know, that kills agriculture, that, the impact it has on the population. And right now you can see it all across the Maghreb. Morocco's grappling with it, Tunisia's grappling with it. There just simply isn't enough water, and water's not something you can really manufacture.
And how much is the dam in Ethiopia and in other
Oh,
countries impacting Egypt?
I mean, the discussion over the GERD in Ethiopia has been going on for years. And I mean, to be fair, the Egyptian government regularly holds summits on it, and they're trying to be the peacemakers in that part of Africa. Um, but that, obviously this dam is going to make it worse.
And then with the water shortage, and the other thing that came to my mind was extreme heat. Like temperatures are very high in Egypt. I think they cut electricity for a couple of hours during the summer.
They've yeah, they've got ongoing rolling power cuts. Well, no, they're not rolling. Um, they were 2 hours, then they expanded them to 3 hours a week or so ago, and now I think they're back to 2 hours. And the authorities are saying that hopefully by the third week in July, they'll no longer need to do power cuts. But, based on, I actually troll the press in various countries every morning on my computer. And I mean, today it's supposed to be 40 degrees Celsius in Egypt again, which of course is what it is here in Washington as well. But so it's drying up crops. And it's doing it, all over the world.
And then all of this climate risks have an impact on the economy, right? And also things like food security, I would say.
Oh, definitely food security.
With regards to things like irrigation, or how would it impact the food security for Egypt?
Yeah, how do you irrigate if you haven't got the water? I mean, things just, and we're seeing it all over, the African continent right now. Things just aren't growing. And if you can't grow them, you can't pick them and buy them and pick them and sell them. There's just, and then, as we've already discussed, wheat imports that they were, not only having trouble getting, but having trouble paying for. So food insecurity about when already 30% of the population lives under the poverty line. And another 30% is sort of right there at it. Um, and you see what the inflation rate is, and much of that is due to food prices. And at the same time, as they're removing subsidies on some of these goods, that's just going to send prices even higher.
And then I guess the last area I wanted to talk to you about was security. Obviously, we've got the situation in Gaza, which is impacting Egypt. Egypt has a lot. It seems to Egypt has a lot of challenges on its borders. It's got Gaza, it's got Sudan, it's got Libya, it's got other countries as well in the region. How big of a risk is security for the country, not just on its border, but also things like civil unrest?
Well, there's UNHCR, the UN High Commission for Refugees, has said that Egypt now hosts more than 600,000 refugees and asylum seekers. A bulk of them right now are obviously, Sudanese are the largest group. What's really concerning is Egypt doesn't Egypt does not want these refugees. And human rights groups are accusing the government of forced refugee deportations. Last year, the government issued a decree requiring undocumented foreign nationals to buy $1,000. Okay, you're an undocumented person from Sudan, $1,000 administrative expense card, and you had to secure an Egyptian host in order to regulate your status. I mean, obviously, the EU has given them lots of money, like $1 billion of their new $8 billion package is precisely for curbing migration to Europe. I mean, the EU has said, well, we'll give you money to help with the refugee situation because we don't want. And at the same time, the Gaza conflict, there is this fear that the porous border will open and Egypt will be flooded with people escaping the war. And UNDP has said that the Gaza conflict could cost Egypt between sort of $3.5 and $13.5 billion in lost tourism and canal revenue through mid-2025.
That's a lot of money.
That's a lot of money.
Mm.
So
These are just like on the border.
the whole security issue is further weighing down the economy.
And this is just on the border, right? This isn't even talking domestically. If food prices become too high or
Right. Precisely. But
Yeah.
Egypt has, Egypt doesn't really, they haven't got the resources to deal with this sort of influx. And of course, arguably no country does. Did Poland have it when the Ukrainians were pouring in? No. I mean, nobody has these these structures in place.
And where do you see the Egyptian economy going in the next couple of years? It sounds like you're not too optimistic on where things are going.
Well, I sort of look back historically, and I mean, in under their last IMF program, and well, the big one in 2016, they had announced partial privatization program for 23 state-owned companies. Well, that never happened. In 2022, under an IMF program, they released a quote-unquote state ownership policy outlining plans for the state to exit from a bunch of sectors. Then in February last year, they announced that 32 state-owned companies would be offered to private investors, either on the stock exchange or to direct investors, and that they would be sold by March 2024. Well, obviously that didn't happen. And the sectors include some of the crown jewels, including, electricity generation, including some of the big banks, including the biggest insurance companies. And it just hasn't happened. And part of that is, according to the IMF, these energy companies that are on the privatization list have outstanding debts to foreign companies, largely German ones like Siemens, of over $4 billion. So would you be inclined to buy a company that's, $4 billion in debt, in hard currency debt?
Doesn't sound like a great deal.
And, as the IMF, I mean, right now, Egypt is too, as I said before, too big to bail, too big to fail. But what's going to happen when the IMF, at review number 4, review number 3 has already been postponed till the end of the month. It was supposed to have already happened. When the IMF says, yeah, okay, so you devalued the currency and you said you were going to float it, and it's not floating. And you said you were going to privatize all these companies by March. Well, now it's the end of 2024 and you've sold 2 of them. Frankly, the IMF is not going to cut Egypt off right now.
Would you say that Egypt's kind of kicking the can down the road until it becomes too unfeasible for them?
Again, I mean, we've seen this play out over the past 30 years. It just keeps playing out. We're going to privatize. We're going to float the currency. We're going to liberalize. We're going to sell off military-owned companies. And the political will's not there.
Yeah, it seems that politically it's not really moving forward. And 2011, a lot of people were like quite optimistic of the change in the politics, but
the politics haven't changed.
Yeah, exactly. I think they're quite deep rooted, and like as we've said, it goes back.
And it needs, as a lot of countries around the world, certainly including my own, there needs to be a generational change. And, in some countries, that's feasible. in places like Egypt, where, they just had an election this year and, well, surprise, surprise, guess who won? Um, because the opposition was in jail, or they weren't allowed to run, or um, so the generational change that needs to happen to move this along is unlikely to happen anytime soon.
And Beth, do you think if Egypt does some reforms, like some of the things that you've mentioned, do you think that they could tap the bond market again, or do you think that would be very unfeasible at the moment?
Oh, I think they could come to market now. They're under an IMF program. The IMF is releasing the money in the installments as promised. And frankly, it's funny, but the bond markets has always or has long believed that if the country's under an IMF program, then we can tap the bond market, because we'll get our money.
Beth, tell us some of your upcoming projects that you're working on and any future projects you're working on.
Well, we've just launched on Substack because it seemed like a really good venue to be able to sort of explore some of the more quote unquote exotic markets that we follow and actually be able to share an opinion and to share some, we've been at this for 35 years. We know, sort of what needs to happen and what mistakes need to be avoided. We're doing there seems to be a lot of new interest in, emerging markets. There's the sense that the Fed's going to cut eventually. We'll get there. They're not going to cut this month, but anyway, the Fed will cut in September, and suddenly interest will revert to emerging markets again. This has happened time and time and time again. You can go back, 35 years. Every time the Fed cuts, emerging markets get a boost. But there's a sense that people are starting to look, beyond India and Mexico. That finally there seems to be some interest in some of the smaller or lesser known markets. And the smaller, India is a great example. Obviously, in the eyes of international fund managers right now, India's stocks and bonds can do no wrong. But what's really interesting is on the equity side, most of the buying is in, the blue chips, the names we know. Whereas domestic Indian investors, who are now the biggest segment of the market, are buying these new IPOs, these SMEs, and they're making tons of money because those are the companies that are performing. So there's a sense that all of a sudden people are going to think, maybe some of the more adventurous investors, definitely, not the ones that just run by the index, maybe we need to explore the second tier companies. That's where, particularly if you still believe the old traditional emerging market story of, the growing consumer segment and better access to financial services for citizens everywhere. It's these second tier companies that are catering to the domestic population that I think are probably the most interesting. And I also think the other area we've been talking to a lot of people about is, despite the pushback against quote unquote ESG here in this country politically, it hasn't gone away. In fact, if anything, international investors in emerging markets are paying even more attention, not just due to climate change, although obviously that's a really significant part of their decision making, But at the S&G, let's really look at the governance of these companies. Let's really see what we're buying. Let's go back to sort of the Mark Mobius way of investing in emerging markets. You go to the country, you kick the tires, you shake the guy's hand, you have drinks with them, you see who you're really dealing with. It's almost more of a way PE and VC investors, look at these markets. Let's see what we're really buying as opposed to buying the three biggest stocks on the exchange. And I think there's also, despite the fact that they haven't done well this year, particularly well this year, there's as global interest rates come down, attention's going to pick up again on the local currency bond markets.
Fantastic. And what's the Substack called?
It's kleimaninternational.substack.
I'll link it in the show notes if you send it to me.
Yeah.
Link in the show notes. And Beth, speaking of your Substack, are you active on social media?
Oh, we're quite active. In fact, we've got sort of the best dedicated emerging markets feed on X. I'll refrain from saying comma, used to be known as Twitter. And we post 8 to 10 posts a day.
Wow.
And we cover the world. It sort of gives people an idea of how much of the world we do cover. I mean, we do cover places like South Sudan, which most people don't look at.
And what's your Twitter handle or your X handle?
It's at KleimanIntCon.
Okay, I'll definitely put those in the show notes as well.
I'll send that to you too.
To see and to get in touch with you, what's the best way? Through LinkedIn or through email or?
LinkedIn or email. I'm big on LinkedIn. I try to post at least twice a week.
Fantastic.
And I love reading what other emerging markets experts have to say too.
Yeah, no, it's definitely interesting talking to other EM specialists and people who are really ingrained in these markets. But Beth Morrissey, this has been a fantastic conversation, and I wish you all the best with the Substack and all the other activities you're doing. Thanks for coming on the podcast.
Great. Thank you so much.
All the best.